Welcome to this edition of Ballotpedia Insights. My name is Dave Beaudoin, and I'm a project lead with the Marquee team here at Ballotpedia. And I'm very excited to host this session with our special guest, Chad Peace, on election policy and voting issues. Chad is both the founder and president of IVC Media, a partner at the law firm of Peace Shea, and is a nationally recognized leader in election law and voter rights. He received his bachelor's degree from UCLA and his law degree from the University of San Diego. And as president of the school's International Arbitration Team, he authored curriculum that became the basis for the school's first 4-credit arbitration program. His consulting firm, IVC, is a nonpartisan digital consulting firm for political causes and candidates, which has won industry awards for excellence in a number of digital media campaigns. The firm manages and develops campaigns to increase voter rights and participation, and to promote and expand voter outreach for local, state, and national efforts. In 2017, Chad was named as one of 40 under 40 by the American Association of Political Consultants. And finally, he is a strategist for the Independent Voter Project, which is a nonprofit organization which seeks to re-engage nonpartisan voters and promote nonpartisan election reform through initiatives, litigation, and voter education. He is also a founding board member for the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, which is actually holding its first annual summit later this week in California. Chad, thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to Ballotpedia Insights.
Thanks for having me.
There are lots of topics we hope to discuss today, especially given that the 2018 midterms, which seem like they're still going on, have highlighted some pretty prominent election issues that we can talk about. However, if you have a question for Chad, please type it in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So before we kind of get started on some of the national issues, Chad, just wanted to further expand the background a little bit in terms of asking you what issues or campaigns you've been involved with recently or are even involved with now.
Well, most recently, we did a voter education effort out educating and making sure independent voters in Maine were understood of the that the ballot question, the ranked choice voting initiative, was on the ballot. For those who don't know, Maine just passed a first statewide effort to change the state elections to ranked choice voting. The issue there was it was on the ballot in a closed primary. So as most people know, in a closed primary, there's not a huge incentive for independent voters who don't have the candidates on the ballot to come out and vote. Voter turnout tends to be substantially less because usually it's just some ballot measures or some local nonpartisan races. So, we, in that effort, did a voter education effort to make sure they understood, what it was, that it was on the ballot, its historic nature, and that they got out to the polls. In San Diego, I actually authored a measure called Measure K 2 years ago in the city of San Diego, which got rid of what's a relatively esoteric rule. It's in a nonpartisan local race. If you got above 50%, they actually didn't hold a general election. This is common in some municipalities, but as insiders know, it's an incumbent protection scheme that, it's very difficult in a city the size of San Diego. You got 1.5 million voters to overcome the name ID in a primary election when not a lot of people are paying attention to get an incumbent below 51%. Very difficult, if not impossible. Measure K simply got rid of that rule and said, you know what, no matter what, we're having a general election, and when voter turnout is twice as high in the general election and there's a better public dialogue, that's when the final candidate should be determined. Skip forward to this year, we expanded it, and we helped the campaign pass it at a countywide level. So the 3 million something voters at the countywide level now for county and city races do not have that rule. So that will have a practical effect on the actual composition, but at the end of the day, it's part of the bigger picture. I think the things we like to work on is, increasing accountability and representation, and we think those changes to the election laws really enhance accountability. Other things we've been involved in, including Recently, we've drafted an amicus brief in support of an organization called Level the Playing Field that's challenging the Presidential Debate Commission's 15% rule. A lot of people may wonder why we haven't had a third candidate on the stage in a long time. And our argument, part of that is because the rules are designed to be that way. So, those are a few of the things we worked on. Our company, unfortunately, I wish I could spend 100% of my life on election reform and voting rights. It's not actually the best sustainable business model. So we have done a lot of other projects that aren't election rights related, but I think are equally exciting and important in their own capacity.
Those are some great issues, Chad. What drove you to become involved in political consulting, and what is the most fulfilling part of that?
Oh, man. This question, obviously, answers always depend on where you start from, what period of time you start from. And I hope this doesn't get me into trouble, but the candidly, how I kind of got here, I'll run through it quick. I grew up in a political family. Saw what the political narrative and partisan politics can do to people who are really trying to do good governance, and swore I wouldn't spend my life getting into politics. That was when I was, high school age. Graduated high school, went into commercial real estate. It was exciting. I enjoyed it. Was doing well. And then this, full disclosure, this crazy guy, Ron Paul, was on the stage in 2007 for the 2008 presidential election. And I saw this Republican talking about civil liberties and getting out of wars overseas. And long story short, me and a business partner who is an incredible technology, genius and web developer and marketer, we were part of that Ron Paul crowd. I compare it to kind of the Bernie Sanders enthusiasm 8 years later, where it was really that I think what drew most people was, look, there's somebody willing to stand up and not take not just tell us because their consultant said to stand, this is where you should be, or this is what the voters want to hear. There was a sense of authenticity there. I think that really drew me back into being participatory in politics. Now, we went on to draft Rand Paul for the Senate, and then, woke up one day and said, well, this isn't a very good, long-term business, life strategy of being involved in, this, this type of stuff. So ended up going back to law school. I think I moderated both my perspective and then my, what I believed was really the root cause of that frustration that breeds the enthusiasm for something different. And we were approached by the Independent Voter Project. And in full disclosure, my father was one of the two co-chairs at the time. They had this crazy idea we're going to make California's primaries nonpartisan. So we're not going to have Republican primaries and Democrat primaries. We're going to make it nonpartisan and get rid of the rules that give the parties an advantage at the first stage. And all that stuff you guys did to raise a whole bunch of money and get people to run for office and do all that. Can you do that for us in California to try to pass this? Because both parties are going to oppose it. Smartly or stupidly, we said, sure. It was a much bigger effort, much different approach than, doing candidate type work and ideological based work. But we did the voter education effort for that. As most of you may know, if you're paying attention to this podcast, and it did pass. And that was really my entrance into the election reform space. I happened to be in my second year of law school at the time they approached us. So by doing that, when they first came to me, I really didn't understand, kind of, for lack of better terms, the revolutionary nature of what it was, and really the big picture of how that reform is just a small progression and a step of trying to make elections fair again for the voters. But I started taking the election law classes and looking at these election laws and the framework of our history of our legal framework. And so since that time, I've gotten involved in legal cases and drafting some initiatives, and also being able to help out where I can on other election reformers who are working across the country to slowly chip away at the institutional barriers that really prevent real electoral competition.
That's a great personal perspective in terms of your evolution in how you kind of got involved in this. That's really interesting. I know you've been involved in both of these initiatives. We had a question from a staff member. I know you've been involved in both ranked choice voting and obviously California's top 2 primary. What are your thoughts on which one of those is more likely to expand to other jurisdictions than they're in currently?
I like that question because there's lots of ways you could, I guess, interpret and run with that question. If you're saying likely to expand in terms of where's the enthusiasm and, where's kind of right now the sense of moving forward, I would say there's a lot of enthusiasm behind ranked choice voting. I think there's a lot of folks looking to accomplish it. If you step back and look at, the top 2 nonpartisan primary, which was first passed in Washington. Now we can put Louisiana aside. I can hear guys like Richard Winger in the background saying Louisiana already has it. So let's say Louisiana, Washington, and then passed in California have been going for about 10 years. They've experienced some, I wouldn't say setbacks, but, there's been attempts to bring it to other states that haven't been quite as successful. But it's been successful in that it's been 10 years. So all the legal challenges against it have been exhausted and it's survived. So from a long-term election reform perspective, that's a major monumental hurdle. There's 3 separate well-funded cases against top 2 trying different angles to take it out, and it survived every time. So in that context, maybe it'll leapfrog and we'll come back, to looking at nonpartisan primaries as a priority. Bringing that together, though, with another direction, what I would say is that there's an evolution amongst the election reformers in that the top 2 folks who may have experienced a ranked choice voting person issue an op-ed of why we shouldn't adopt top 2, or vice versa, are, as you alluded to earlier, sitting down, having their first annual summit, and I think really genuinely understanding that we're in the same fight. And at the end of the day, we have our perspectives about what we think is the next best step or the ultimate perfect, utopia election system, right? But the reality is most of us don't know. We don't know what's perfect, but both movements towards or enthusiasm towards ranked choice voting, as well as those for top 2 nonpartisan primaries, are really just 2 oars rowing on the same ship. And we're really trying to reach the same goal. So one of the things that I can say has been put out there the last couple years, for those of you who are aware of, Michael Porter and Catherine Gell's study that came out of Harvard suggesting ways to increase competition and maximize voter choice. They've put on the table, why not have nonpartisan primaries where the folks who are supporting nonpartisan primaries say that's fundamentally important because you can't give private interests in exclusive access to the first stage of the election process. And the only way to do that is for it to be nonpartisan. Well, the ranked choice voting people and the people who may say top 2 limits choices have a legitimate argument and say, well, when you winnow the process in the primary, you do narrow the candidates for the general election. So folks like Catherine Gell and Independent Voter Project and Fair Vote and have talked and worked with folks across the electoral reform aisle and say, well, what about a nonpartisan primary where 4 people go on to the general election? And then you utilize ranked choice voting in the general election to avoid the spoiler effect and to avoid having non-majority outcomes, right? So we could see a scenario where somebody, whether it's in California or in another state, really combines the 2 and says, we're not doing top 2, we're not doing ranked choice, we're going to do a top 4 and utilize ranked choice just for the general election. So I don't know exactly where it's going to go or what it's going to do, but there's a lot of things behind the scenes that have to come together in order to execute successful election reform. And at the end of the day, all those variables, I think are not quite certain enough to know where the next big strike's going to happen.
That's interesting. In terms of the ranked choice voting, I'm sure you're familiar with the legal challenges that have been made to it and whatnot. Do any of those arguments that you've read seem to hold any kind of water? Do you think that those kind of challenges will go anywhere, or are you pretty confident that the way Maine has set up their ranked choice voting will withstand those challenges?
It's an interesting one. There's lots of different areas of legal challenge that you can bring. Some of them, are state related. There's ways that Maine's Constitution has written stuff where, the ranked choice voting as written may come into conflict. Then there's the other argument that Maine has basically makes what laws created by the people are supreme, and therefore, they have to change the Constitution to be in conformance with the new ranked choice voting. There's some things like that that are complex. I think they'll survive, and that Maine does have a heightened appreciation for people-driven initiatives, and that now it'll end up in a place where, look, courtrooms don't want to get into the politics. I mean, that's why voting rights court cases historically have taken a long time even to get into the courtroom to be heard, let alone settled by the courts. And in this case, you have a legislature and the people really going, for the historical context, this Maine ranked choice voting was not only initiatives, but it was initiatives, legislative fights, legal fights. The fact that the people just kept coming back and then finally approved it with an 8-point margin in a closed primary, right? So you have partisans coming out in a primary saying, we want to change this partisan, this partisan focused system. I think that's going to survive within that context. But if you then go and look at a couple other ancillary legal issues that are related, it's really interesting. Some of them are funny. For example, one of the Maine GOP, and I'm not picking on the GOP because I can talk about some funny arguments made by Democrats in other areas. Their argument in court was literally that you can't have ranked choice voting in the primary because we have the right to select our nominees by minority rule, and ranked choice voting requires us to reach a minority, right? So I think that's a little bit of an absurdity. You actually have a private organization going to the state courtroom and saying, protect us because we have the right to select nominees using a system that we choose, which we want it to be a minority rule-based system, which in a plurality system, your nominees generally get elected with less than 50% of the vote. Then you also, if you take another step back, I think the larger legal fight, and sorry I'm getting wonky and in the weeds here, but I figure the participants on this call have a particular interest in this, is I think this one should be relatively simple and clear, is that there's a real fight going on with open primaries and closed primaries. Most simply, closed primaries, voters that are not members of a party can't participate. Open primaries allow independent voters to choose what ballot they want to participate on. The fundamental issue, whether it's open or closed in a traditional system, is the ownership, is that these nomination processes belong to the party, and they're for the benefit of a party choosing the nominee. Why that's important is that there's a First Amendment argument that was articulated and successfully litigated by the Democratic Party, the California Party v. Jones, and the judge who wrote the opinion was Justice Scalia, right? So to understand the nonpartisan nature of election rights and the direction, you have the Democratic Party argued it, Scalia decided it, and frankly, I agree with the opinion, and I'll get back to why I do. It's the party's right of choosing the nominee, and forcing any voter that's not a member of that party, their argument was violating their right of non-association. So they have a fundamental right to get together, band together, make decisions together. And if you force people that don't agree with them on stuff to choose their nominees, well, then you violated their First Amendment right. Why there's the big conflict is because there are a lot of election reformers simply want to open up the primaries. I think it butts against that decision in Democratic Party v. Jones, which was decided narrowly on California's old open blanket primary. But I think you extrapolate that, all open primaries eventually become suspect in terms of their legal. So if you jump forward to whether it's ranked choice voting, as you mentioned in the original question, or California's nonpartisan primary, I think where a lot of these election litigation fights come to a head is looking at the primary itself and asking the question to the court, is the primary not a fundamental part of our public election process? And so therefore, can we give private interests, the political parties, exclusive access to that first stage of the public process, which determines our viable nominees? And if you say that the state, whether it's Maine or California or anyone else, cannot give exclusive access to private parties whose membership is declining, and there it has to allow every voter to participate, then how do you construct the primary election? You can't do an open partisan or a closed partisan primary. You have to have some form of a nonpartisan primary, or you have a partisan primary that has another ballot that everyone else can participate on. So, you know, I think there's a lot of things to be settled, but at its crux, there is this ongoing legal fight where you have the Republican Party in Montana challenging open primaries and the Democratic Party in Hawaii challenging open primaries with the very same argument. At the end of the day, reformers, I think, like myself, are saying what this real fight is the right of the individual voter, regardless of party, to access the process, and that the parties don't have the exclusive right to determine who does and does not get to vote.
Thanks. I guess in talking about the California top two primary then, and even other states that have open primaries, to what extent does initiatives by one party or the other to promote maybe candidates that they would prefer to run against rather than the other party's preferred candidate, how does that factor into any either of the legal arguments or the potential success of doing a top two nonpartisan primary?
Well, I think you're always going to have the case where operatives are going to try to game the system. So you have to start, I think, with the assumption that whether you're operating an old traditional system or a top two or ranked choice, the operatives are going to figure out how to best manipulate the circumstances that there are, right? So for us, I think the most important thing is, well, at least start on the basis that the rules are fair for everybody. So those gaming the system are at least gaming a fair system, not a system that started off rigged in favor of somebody or somebody else. So, you know, for example, it is common that in a traditional primary system, the Republican or the Democrat is in close districts is going to make sure there's a libertarian with just enough funds to pick off 2 to 5% of the Republicans. Republicans are going to make sure that there's a green candidate to pick off 2 to 5% of the Democrats. So that's a game played in the traditional system. In your question, in a top two system, will Democrats maybe put a second Democrat or something that could prevent a qualified Republican, or fund a far right Republican, or encourage them and run ads to support somebody they'd run? That's going to happen. To the extent that it really is anything out of the ordinary with the games that were played under traditional systems, I would argue it's not even, it's not anything that hasn't been done before or just in a different context, nor is it anything that's, extraordinarily like it's completely changing the system altogether. As it relates to the law and the legal stuff, there were a lot of arguments against top two, in particular, that you know, and actually in the open primaries cases of that, you know, parties will, because you don't have this barrier to entry from nonpartisan voters, that the parties would use that to get voters to vote for weaker candidates and stronger candidates. One of the last rulings that came out of, I forget what circuit it was, addressed that issue and essentially said, look, parties and candidates have a hard enough time getting voters to come out and vote for them. Nobody's ever come into this courtroom with actual evidence in any of these cases that there's been any significant success in motivating a large base of voters, enough voters to come out and change an election to get a lesser candidate to come out and vote. And so, you know, I think the short answer is in the courtrooms, at least, they're suspect because there's not really evidence of it going on that level. But in the practical sense, in terms of gamesmanship, I think it's always a factor and always will be a factor no matter what system you're in.
That's a good point. I mean, as you say, Libertarian, Green Party candidates, they pop up in the closed systems all the time. So although it gets a lot of media attention when it's done on a bigger scale, I guess it really is the case that those types of things are going to happen if you've got consultants involved who are trying to figure out the best way to help their candidate, right?
Right. It's competition at the end of the day for the operatives and the people involved in the races. And, you know, I think it goes back to, that's why we always go back to the fundamental question is you're going to have the competition. You know, people on each side are going to try to bend the rules of that competition or go as far as they can or play the game theory. Is that at least we need to start with the basis of voters, candidates, and everybody are treated the same, at least as it relates to the state. In the state, when they're conducting an election, shouldn't say, well, you're a political party, therefore you get this. And you're a voter registered with a political party, therefore you get this. And then treat other voters differently because they've exercised their referring back to the Democratic Party's argument, voters also have the right of non-association. So, you know, why should voters, by virtue of exercising their right not to associate with the Democratic or Republican Party, be treated any differently or be denied access to the first stage of the public process because they don't want to join?
All right. I have one more question about California, and I think it's come up in some of the tweets from the president and, you know, talking points on different news channels. The way California implements their mail-in ballot system seems to result in this long period where votes are being counted. And I don't notice the same thing happening in Washington or Colorado, two other states that have more a similar system. Is it the way California's system is designed that makes that take longer, or just the size of California? Can you speak to what is really the cause of those types of issues?
Combination. I mean, we have very large number of large counties that do their things differently. But I think a lot of it is you have one of the things we don't talk about a lot, whether it's in terms of voting rights or any policy issue, is there's always unintended consequences when you go and try to advance something on the one hand. There's usually drawbacks on the other. So as it relates to California, you know, on one sense, we can applaud the folks in California that have been very instrumental in pushing forward on making sure we do everything to increase voter turnout and access. So California's done things like motor voter registration, right? The unintended consequences, some people end up getting registered, you know, there's arguments of whether it's accidental or not. I would argue it's most likely accidentally get registered that really shouldn't be, okay? Another thing that they have done is made sure that people, when they receive a ballot, that it does get counted. So California passed legislation that as long as the county registrars receive the ballot within 3 days of the election, so they could be received. So as long as their theory is you could have participated on election day, put it in the mail, but it might not be received for 3 days. So the law allows that 3 days to actually be received, right? So you have you have issues everywhere from validating that the right people are voting or actually voting to registrars receiving ballots after, and then you have to compare that with the people that actually voted to make sure you don't have duplication. And then you have more and more people voting that way that it's hard to measure how many are going to come in. They're coming in late. And then when they do, they take longer to count. And so all these factors just start building up, right? And it's easy to go into the national narrative where everything is reduced down to the talking points to make it appear as if one side's pure evil and the other side's pure good, and the reality is, going back to the thing, everybody's trying to game the system a little bit, everybody's trying to take advantage of the rules, but at the end of the day, right, there's a complex process. The people that increased voter access on the one hand have created a situation where it makes it more difficult to count. I mean, if we had a simple, this is election day and you go to your polls and you vote, and it'd be much easier and we get the counts much faster. Okay, but then do we want to go, the question is then, do we want to go back to that system, or do we want to continue advancing the ability to make it access? But California is unique in taking long because we've pushed the envelope on how much we want to make sure everybody that can vote does vote.
And in terms of that, I guess in the long term, you see states going to both voting by mail or early voting as ways of increasing voter participation. Which one of those do you think will be more likely to increase voter participation in the long run, or does it really depend on the geography of that particular location?
It's probably on geography, and I think the likelihood as we go to more vote by mail, we'll move towards more and more vote by mail. But as you see, and maybe California's experience will pull the reins on the horses maybe a little bit. I don't know. I think that's likely the direction. But at the same time, I think the conversations that really need to be had is get out of the superficial debate where if you oppose something like that, that somehow you're anti-voting rights, and have the real discussion of those unintended consequences. There's an issue. I'm also a campaign operator. I run campaigns and I do messaging strategies and stuff. So if you want to think about money in politics, right? As you extend the election period, right? And so now people are voting over a 3-week window, and now they can turn it in on the last day. Think about the money it takes to continue a messaging program at high speed over a period of 3 weeks. Who does that advantage? The little guy with just a little bit of money in their campaign that otherwise could focus on a single election day? Or the big money who have the ability to run TV ads for 3-4 weeks straight, knowing that any day these voters could be voting? So those are conversations where who has the right answer? I don't know. That may not mean get rid of a 3-week window to mail in your ballots or have election day, but it's an unintended consequence that if we really want to have election reform that best serves voters, we need to discuss without vilifying the people who may have come to a different conclusion on that issue.
I totally agree with you. It's a very good point. We've just kind of devolved on some of these things into these talking points on each side where, one way of doing things is all good and one way of doing things is all bad. And as you say, the issues are a lot more complicated than that. Yeah. Changing gears a little bit, I know you wrote a column last month for the Dallas News where you talked about participation of younger voters and what could really be done to increase their participation in the process. Can you kind of elaborate some of the ideas that you had on that, and what do you think are the main obstacles to younger folks participating?
I still consider myself a younger voter, but I realize I'm getting a little bit older. I think the biggest, I'm not sure it's necessarily an obstacle. I think it's a mentality that, I kind of grew up at the beginning of, Facebook came out at the end of as I was graduating college. And so I've kind of gotten the perspective of, not really being involved, but then also still growing up at a young age with that kind of, I only bring that up in that we've kind of grown up in an environment where, like, I want lunch today, I can go into my phone and like select from 50 different places and they'll deliver it to my office within 20 minutes, right? That we grow up, we're accustomed to quick, rapid, and an enormous amount of choices on the one hand. We also have the ability to, parties, for example, they've traditionally, and I'm not saying they still aren't, been important vehicles for change. I wanted to end slavery. So the party was the most important vehicle that helped us end slavery. Women needed the right to vote. The parties were the most important vehicle to get women the right to vote. Those were the political mechanisms by which we got to change. Today, I want to go and, help somebody survive cancer, or I want to help this company develop a new product. You can go on GoFundMe or whatever it is. You can directly participate in the change in the world you want to see directly without having some other vehicle. And I think younger voters who don't have the sense of party loyalty or the sense of, dedication to a particular political party don't really see this. Why do I need this party who I may see I don't really particularly like, or they haven't made any great change in my life or anybody I know? Why do I have to execute my vote through them, and why do I have to listen to them? So I think, going back to your question, how do you get voters involved? I think we have to appreciate that the parties can still are and will be important vehicles for change, but we got to stop thinking in terms of the red and blue mentality that voters, especially young, want to be persuaded and pushed into one side or the other. I think we do see, and young voters do see, a lot more nuance, and they want to be able to pick and choose, okay, I believe this here and that here, and not as this monolithic unit where everybody's the same and you're either red or you're blue. And so I think that goes back to, how do we conduct elections? Do we, things like ranked choice voting, how do we give people more options? And how do we provide a path towards meaningful participation, which allows young voters to participate without having to identify themselves with one of the two sides of, the divisiveness? The last point I'll make is alluding back to the social stuff. I mean, there are people who are very divisive and make their opinions known on Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that, but it's really not the substantial majority of us. And I think the substantial majority of young voters, the moment you get in and say you got to participate by being a part of one side or the other, are going to say, why am I going to do that? I'm going to lose a whole bunch of friends, and and then I get identified with all the absurdities of my side that I don't want to continue to defend. So, do I have the answer? No. I got a lot of pontification.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I have college age kids, and some of these questions actually come up in talking to them. I had, in the document that I sent you yesterday, there was a discussion. The survey's a little bit old, from 2014. Ariel Edwards Levy brought up a study that was done that basically asked a whole bunch of people back in 2014, should everybody have the right to vote, or should everybody vote, or should only well-informed citizens? And what she found was there was a big age disparity. Younger folks generally thought that only, or more predominantly, well-informed citizens should vote, whereas older folks thought that everyone should vote. Like I said, I kind of noticed that a little bit in the discussions that I've had with my college age kids. What are your thoughts about that finding? Mrs. Levy's comment was basically that young people seem to set a high bar for being informed enough to vote, and that they sometimes conclude that they don't meet that bar. Do you feel that some of the election processes that we have play into that a little bit, or is that just a separate sociological factor that's at play?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting discussion. I actually was having this talk with some folks the other day, some younger voters who tend to be more on the left and expressing grievances, and they kind of came to the same conclusions. Maybe we should have some kind of test, and maybe we should, I said, well, maybe we should have a poll tax, and maybe we should, right? So it's ironic that, the grievances over the system is saying, well, it's because some voters are not informed, and therefore, and I'm an informed voter, and therefore to exclude them, right? I think we've gone down that path of history, then, that only brings up new questions. Well, how do you determine who's an informed voter, right? How do you come up with all kinds of stuff? I think the reason our court system settled, and one of the, this was obviously over malapportionment issues, which we don't need to get into that, but the ruling was one person, one vote, going back to, we were talking about before, okay? You can have all kinds of different ideas, but at the end of the day, you have to measure the consequences and like what's the real effect of all this stuff. I think if you really believe in democracy, you believe that in the aggregate, voters will make the right decision by treating everybody equally. Because the moment you don't start treating people equally, talk about gaming the rules, right? Then you're excluding people from participating in democracy because of your idea of their inadequacy. The irony is, if you really believe in democracy, and I pointed out the irony, I think, coming from somebody who's pretty far left, okay, so they're uninformed, and then are you saying that then their participation in your government is now, you shouldn't have any participation in government? Or should you say, maybe if knowing they're participating in the government, we have an obligation to make sure we have less uninformed people, right? And that we need to do a better job of educating them, if you consider we as the people who are these somehow more enlightened than the rest of the world, right? I think, democracy is tough, and, there's people, debate over time what's the best system. And at the end of the day, democracy gives us a framework to create rules around it that are fair and, set up the conditions for good governance. It can be abused and it can be used to our advantage. But once you start getting down to the level of saying, no, some people deserve to be included in democracy and some don't, you're really not talking about democracy anymore. That's when you start getting into the area of authoritarianism, because you've now taken the authority upon yourself to say, these people aren't part of our people-based democracy.
Very good point. Very good point. All right, we have about 15 minutes left, and there's just kind of a handful of issues that I think were pretty prominent in just this last year or so. So I was just going to throw a couple issues out there and see what your reactions are. First of all, there's talk. This is from a viewer. There's talk sometimes about compulsory voting. How countries in Europe and other places in the world have a system of compulsory voting where I don't know what the penalties necessarily are, but you're pretty much, expected to, required to vote. Any thoughts on how that works in those locations? And it's something that I think would probably provoke a pretty strong reaction here in the US.
Yeah. And, I think the first thing is, it's ironic. Think about the last question. Some people shouldn't be allowed to vote. Now we're getting to a question of we should force everybody to vote no matter what, right? So talk about pushing out some uninformed. Now you have uninformed, unwilling voters coming to the polls, right? Now also think about that in terms of the money in politics. Are we so naive to think, okay, well, they're going to game the system in California because we have a nonpartisan primary and do all this stuff? You don't think that the money in politics will game a system when now you have a whole populations that aren't paying attention at all, don't want to go to the polls, that can be possibly manipulated. The last thing is there are countries that have done it, and they certainly haven't solved the $1 million question of how to do democracy perfectly, right? I think, I could get shot at, I could get maybe blacklisted amongst a section of the election reform community for saying this. I think that's a monumental shift in the American experience, where we prided ourselves on freedom of choice to do something. A lot of people would argue that not voting is making a statement unto itself. I would, from the perspective of let's not put up any walls between people and voting, and let's encourage them to do so. Let's make the rules fair. Once we start forced voting, we get everything into all kinds of issues of, there's much worse ways people can game the system. But most importantly, we get a false sense of the democracy that we really have. When we have low voter turnout, at least we're honest about the people that are participating and that are supporting this system. And if we get down to 1%, we know the government really is not representing a lot of people at all. when we say we're going to force 100% turnout and get, this candidate got 5 bajillion votes. Well, did they really get 5 bajillion votes, or did you force them to come out and vote for that candidate because the other candidate was, was worse? I mean, and then you can extend that to, I don't like using extreme examples and saying we're on, everything's here, but we know there's countries where they force you to vote and they claim to be constitutional democracies and republics and stuff. I think you get a real false sense of legitimacy when you start going down that path.
All very good points. A lot of conversations, a lot of discussions about polling. Polling is becoming so prevalent now in statewide elections, congressional elections. What effect do you think all of this news coverage about polling has on voter participation? And is it just anything that anybody can do anything about?
I don't know if anything we do about it. There's lots of variety of factors in polling. As one, people aren't answer their landlines anymore, so it's relatively new trying to pull them online. Calling people cell phones more difficult in part because there's different laws in different states what you can do. And brings you back to the whole so there's one question of reliability, right? The other is, as an operative, a lot of pollster consultants, they aren't hired by some, philanthropist in the world who was like, I really want to know exactly what's going on. Sure, there are some news stations and some, organizations that are more credible than others, but I mean, it's undeniable that there's a partisan bend to the major news outlets. It's undeniable that the political operatives on both sides are the ones spending the real money doing the polling. And so the question then becomes, how much of the polling is accurate, and or how much of the polling is conducted in the first place in order to, like you said, so that there can be a story, so that it can motivate voters, and so that it can frame a narrative that is trying to be this long-term narrative that one side or the other is trying to push. So ultimately that comes back to reliability too. I think that we do have an issue that, polling, it's hard to say, hard to say the methods that are the best right now in order to poll people. But then it's also hard to say how much pollsters are really, hold the ethic, similar to in journalism, is that their job is to actually produce the result they want. And the last thing is, voter turnout, in part, I think, because of how divided and partisan things have got, it's so much harder to determine what voters are going to come out. There's really less consistency in terms of the number of voters that come out. And so when you're going and doing polling, you have to say, well, extrapolate that based on a voter turnout that is historical. Well, if every year things change so dramatically because of the swings and the, enthusiasm and the partisan nature, it's just hard to predict. And so at the end of the day, I wish we would do a lot less reliance on having polls drive our conversation about politics in the first place. But, I'm certainly not going to be ending that.
Well, and as you say, polls become the story in and of themselves. So if you're looking as a media outlet to have news to talk about the election, I don't know relatively how expensive polls are, but you can create you can create a story that you can then talk about for hours on end if necessary.
It was very good. I mean, one of the things on polling, just, to kind of put into context of election reform fights that relate to polling, the 15% plus one rule we alluded to in the presidential debate lawsuits at the beginning of this conversation, right? One of the issues is how reliable is the polling? So here you have a case where they basically say 5 major news outlets need to show you at 15% in the public opinion polls in order for you to qualify for the debate. Well, think about how important the way the questions are framed and are they doing. What they say, will you vote for the Republican? Yes or no? Will you vote for the Democrat? Yes or no? Okay, if you had a third alternative and you could vote for any of these candidates, which one would you choose, right? Framing the question, can you imagine how difficult it is to get 15% in a poll where the questions are framed that way, right? That is how it happens on the presidential level. Now, you're getting down into other races and stuff. The ability to manufacture a change in 4 or 5% one way or another, it's really not that difficult. And that's not a challenge to every pollster to say none of them have any ethics or are trying to produce results. A lot of them are, but people are trying to create the narratives they do. And sometimes, frankly, I think even the way the questions are asked aren't even intended to be loaded, but they are, because even pollsters have humanity and perspective, and sometimes they get embedded into the questions.
Very true, very true. All right, one other topic I wanted to hit on before we get to a last question, and that is, and I don't know if this is squeezing it in a way too short a window, but there's been a lot of talk in 2018 about voting technology, paper ballots, machines, machines not working, talk about the infrastructure in a lot of jurisdictions in the United States, whether or not it's been properly invested in. Is there a consensus about what is the best voting technology going forward, and really where is the consensus on that issue?
First, I'm clear, this not my area of expertise, and so my perspective is framed by a relatively less knowledge than some people that have made that this is their issue of their life. But I can say with certainty there is no consensus on where it should go. There's advocates for, there's advocates for everything. We should just go back in pencil and paper to, we should have a blockchain national system that, so there's very divergent views on where we should go. Me personally, back to the issues of what we should make everything fair, and we should limit the ability of people who will inevitably trying to game the system. One of the things that I think should be talked about is like, look, we shouldn't be interlinking stations. If you're going to go to use technology, why start linking them up? Can't you just have reporting at single poll locations and stuff that aren't linked to others? Is it really that big of a task to aggregate them? What that does is decentralize it and makes the ability to come in and hack the entire system a lot more difficult. So that's one thing from my relatively non-expertise opinion is, should be out there on the table. I just think, given the time constraints of our question, and also, the limits of my knowledge on this area, is just saying, just practically stepping back from common sense, look at the stuff that we can do with technology now. I can look at my phone and open it and then order a, cupcake from down the street within 30 seconds. The fact that we can't apply that same concepts of technology into the most important part of our American experience, I think is absurd. And it's one issue, one thing to lodge a grievance like I did. It's another thing to solve it. I think the only way it ends up getting solved is by, going in and getting enough people to shake their legislators and the candidates and say, look, we're tired of these petty squabbles over manufactured issues that are designed to divide us amongst each other. Here's some things that we should really be focusing on attention, step out of that stuff, and let's get the experts at the table who really do have practical answers and solutions. And that's way easier said than done, but that's, I think, the state of the world now.
Yeah, I totally agree. The question I wanted to end on, and it's actually different folks viewers have written in with a similar bent on it. And that is, what is the best way that people that are interested in election policy can stay up to date about these types of issues? How can citizens best influence these decisions, whether it's locally within their own area or maybe on a national level? What's really the best way to stay on top of these things?
Well, I think obviously depends on your interest and involved and kind of what you want to do. Some people just want to stay informed. Some want to get active. Online, there's something, IVN.us is something I've helped get off the ground. It's IVN.us is, we cover news and information in the election reform space. There's organizations like Represent Us or Fair Vote, or Ballotpedia is a great one if you follow the new legislation and stuff coming out. there's, finding the organizations, Google search, election reform or nonpartisan reform or things like that. Find the organizations, and there's really not a ton of them. Once you start, it's not that hard when you find the internet. You find one, you go down the rabbit hole and find the things that you like. And if you want to get more active, is fine if there's a, whether it's a Represent Us or Unite America, or there's some of these organizations out there. League of Women's Voters is very involved in voting rights. Like, be cognizant of where the perspectives of different organizations and advocates are, and then inform yourself by doing a deep dive into this area. But there is information out there. There's a lot more today than there was 4 or 5 years ago. Know that there are no experts with silver bullets, including myself. It's impossible to have all the information. We're at a very nascent stage, I think, still, and we will be for the next 10 years, which means there's a lot of opinions and very few perfect answers. So the best way to do it is don't take anybody's conclusions for certain, and understand that there's an interesting dynamic here and that there's a lot of opportunity. And the good news is there's more and more people in this space saying, look, we got a real problem. We're willing to sit at a table and understand we don't all have all the answers, but let's figure out what are some good steps forward from here, and let's try some things out.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. We could go on for another hour or more, but that's all the time that we have. Thank you for your perspectives, Chad, on these very important issues. This has been really entertaining and enlightening for me, and I hope it was for our viewers as well. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. Love everything Ballotpedia does, and appreciate the good work you all do. And it's been fun for me as well. So thank you.
And I want to thank all of our viewers and listeners for joining us today. Thank you for participating, and we hope to see you for our next edition of Ballotpedia Insights, which will happen sometime in the new year. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great day.